Hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Toobin, and we're going to talk about the police, sort of following on to the last panel, and talk about some of the solutions. And let me just start with some numbers for your consideration. 1,138 people were killed by the police in 2015. 965 of them were fatally shot. 235 were unarmed. Young black men were 9 times more likely than other Americans to be killed by law enforcement. On the other side of the equation, 129 police officers were reported killed in the line of duty in 2015. This is a number that includes death by heart attack, automobile accident, and illness. 39 of those officers were killed by gunfire. And so what this panel is really about is to try to address what police and communities can do to reduce both of those numbers. And let me introduce our distinguished panelists. Cedric Alexander currently serves as the Deputy Chief Operating Officer for the Office of Public Safety in Dekalb County, Georgia. Dr. Alexander began his law enforcement career in 1977, serving as a police officer before moving up to become chief. He currently serves on the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives and on the board, and was appointed to President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. Brittany Packnett, hello Brittany, who also serves on the President's 21st Century Policing Task Force, is the Executive Director of Teach for America in St. Louis. She's an activist within the Black Lives Matter movement, and in 2015, she launched Campaign Zero, a web platform offering policy-driven solutions to end police-involved shootings. Jill Leovy is a fellow journalist. She's with the LA Times, and she founded their Homicide Report as a means of chronicling the victims of murder in South LA. Her critically acclaimed and terrific book, Ghettoside, A True Story of Murder in America, was published last year. And finally, we are joined by Dub Lawrence, a former Utah sheriff who founded his county's first SWAT team back in the 1970s, the SWAT team that 30 years later killed his son-in-law, Brian Wood, in the video you just saw. So Dub, let me start with you. That is a personal horror story for you, but it's also a policy lesson about how the police deal with situations of an armed person. I mean, Brian was armed. What should have been done differently in that circumstance?
I can only speak to that from my own personal experience. I founded the SWAT team in 1975. I was elected sheriff in 1974, so it was a new thing. In the 60s, I was in the Marine Corps. During the Watts riots, a lot of the things were happening that were more violent in the country. But when I left the Marine Corps and became a police officer and then was elected county sheriff, that was something that seemed to be the right thing to do, considering the events of the times. But I had a philosophy. I took an oath as a Marine, I took an oath as a police officer, I took an oath as a county sheriff, and they're all similar. But on my honor, I will do my duty. Excuse me. Back up. I can't believe this.
You don't have to do the oath.
The oath of office that was that I took included, when I swore in my officers as deputies, as sheriff, I can remember the part of the sheriff, but I solemnly swear that I will obey, support, and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of this state, and discharge my duty with fidelity. And then I also added the first paragraph of the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics, and it states, as a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is to serve mankind, to safeguard lives and property, to protect the innocent from deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, the peaceful against violence or disorder, and to respect the constitutional rights of all persons to liberty, equality, and justice. And that was the philosophy back in the 70s. That's the way we trained our officers. Every SWAT operation the whole effort was to neutralize, to diffuse, to negotiate. If we had had a failed operation, if somebody got hurt or killed, it would have been a failed operation. The changes that have occurred over the last 45 years, those changes have impacted our society tremendously. And when I watched and witnessed my son being shot to death by the police, and then the police actually put over the press for 20 hours that it was a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the chest. It was the misinformation, it was a practice. There were 46 SWAT officers within 50 feet of him. He was totally contained. There was no reason whatsoever to use deadly force.
So let me just stop you there. Cedric, when you think about what you're responsible for outfitting your officers as well as hiring them, one of the striking things about the scene there was the extreme militarization of the process. We certainly saw it in Ferguson. What's your approach to the kind of equipment your police force needs?
Well, first of all, let me put things in a little historical context as it relates to your question. Very long standing in this country, particularly communities of color and police have had this not so good of a relationship, if you will. We also have to own and accept the fact that also in policing, we have done a number of things historically that have oppressed people throughout the history of this nation, going back to the beginning of police departments. So we fast forward up, we all know the history of police and community. Some communities it has been far greater than others, but we know that there are communities that still struggle a great deal with developing those relationships. And if we move fast forward again now to Ferguson, and in Ferguson what we saw was a misuse of specialized weapons and tactics, better known as SWAT, with M4 rifles being pointed down range at American citizens who were just merely exercising their constitutional right. That for us was a unique experience and embarrassment for this entire nation, from the White House right to Main Street. And around the globe, people did not accept that, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, liberals or conservatives. Nobody liked the idea of American citizens being threatened by the local police for merely exercising their rights. That was a horrible optic that set the tone that the conversation we're having right now as it relates to demilitarization of policing. So we do have to demilitarize, and we cannot use that type of force in any and every incident or event that we may come in contact with. Now, but let's be very realistic as well, because we also live in a time post 9/11 where if you think about San Bernardino, California, where local police had to respond to a threat, a live, active threat. They needed the equipment, they needed the weaponry, and they needed the training, and they also needed the policy that the sheriff talked about that needs to be in place in order to carry out that act. But that is not in each and every call you go to. You don't take, in my opinion, you don't take a SWAT team just because you go into a crack house. That's a little bit over the top. Even though there may be some indications of guns that may be inside, and we understand that, but I think we have to be a lot more conservative in terms of that approach going forward. Because what the American people expect is a police department that is trained to protect them, have all the necessary equipment and resources in order to do so, because that's the time that we live in. We can be in a theater, we can be in a mall, we can just be somewhere minding our business where we want police to be able to respond to rescue us. And to do that, they have to be safe, they have to have the necessary equipment in order to do so. But we cannot, as we saw on this video and many other images we've seen across the country, allow that type of force being used in any and all circumstances.
Brittany, you feel free. Brittany, you see the scenes of the militarization. Is the problem what the cops have or what the cops do?
I would say it's a bit of both, right? And I want to be clear that we're operating in a reality, because the reality is we're not just talking about optics or images, right? We're talking about the fact that myself and several other young women that live in St. Louis are having conversations with our OBGYNs right now, wondering if tear gas is going to have an effect on our reproductive system, right? We're talking about children and wondering if tear gas, and then, well, not if, how tear gas, M16s, and the psychological and physical damage that they have endured on the streets of Ferguson and, quite frankly, on the streets of St. Louis, how that will affect their educational, employment, and college outcomes, right? So I want to just make sure that we are situating this in more than just an image on a screen, because this is real for you, right? I know this is real for everyone up here, and so I want to start off that way. But Dr. Alexander is exactly right in saying that we were out there in Ferguson engaging in our democracy in the way that people tell us to, right? In the way that the great founders of this country did. But when we did it in our black skin with our rap music and our young selves, we were considered threats instead of patriots. And so at the end of the day, it's about what the cops have, it's about what they do, but it's also about how American society draws up young people of color as people to be seen as enemy combatants instead of the full citizens that we are and the respect that we deserve.
Now, Jill, you have written that Black Lives Matter, but also Black Deaths Matter. And you have written about how African Americans are overwhelmingly the victims of the crimes that you have written about in LA. We talk about this this story a lot in the sense of over-policing, too much, but do you suggest that under-policing is also a big part of the problem?
I do. I think one of the things we have to look at when we look at both the number of police officers who die and the number of people who are killed by police in this country is it's part of the big picture, the large context, is that the U.S., relatively speaking, compared to other developed Western nations, is extremely violent, strangely violent, and has been all through its history. It's a very peculiar thing about American history that you see great wealth, you see elaborate development of institutions, as you do in European countries, but you see this very, very high rate of violence. I think that you have to conclude that both deaths at the hands of the police and the death of police officers are part of that overall context of violence. And to say the obvious, we cannot talk about policing without talking about crime. Crime is what police do. And so it always has to be part of the conversation.
But what do you mean by under-policing?
So when you look at the American exception, you say, what is it about America that makes it exceptional? One of the things that stands out is weak policing throughout our history. We have very, very fragmented police. Think about it. Our highest crimes, murder, our state crimes, our law enforcement agencies, our municipal bureaucracies, for the most part, they're different from place to place. I was thinking in Freddie Gray, you know, the paddy wagon was outlawed in LA in about late 70s, early 80s, I think. So you're talking about decades of difference in practice in different police departments around the country. It's a fragmented system, and we have a very strong tradition going all the way back through the 19th century of communal justice, of posse justice in this country. This is cowboy country. I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. That is of a piece with very threadbare, very weak law enforcement. And when I say weak, I think sort of the focal point of that weakness is solving crimes. And I use homicide in my book partly because it's the most countable crime and partly because it's the most important crime. Violent crime against persons is a political force. It has to be controlled in a society if there's going to be control. And you see, the John Jay students and professors here can argue with me, but I think you see a very strong pattern of very low rates of solving both homicide and assault going all the way back to the 19th century. And this is a fundamental problem that really we need a lot of research and we need a lot of work on.
Cedric, I know you want to jump in, but I mean, it is a fascinating and little known fact that most homicides, particularly in poorer communities, there are no arrests, there are no prosecutions. I mean, they just don't these cases don't get solved.
That's right, and violence is different. Violence is a very, very particular thing. If you do not have a state monopoly on violence, it is dispersed, and you have violence elsewhere. And what was so gripping to me about researching Ghettocide is to see the similarities between South Central, Northern Ireland, South Africa, favelas of Brazil. They all tend to have similar traits, these environments. They're rumor-rich, there's communal justice. It's very clear that there's underlying forces.
Cedric, you wanted to
Yeah, let me speak from the position of an active duty police administrator. The juxtaposition here that both police and community is in many communities that are very much challenged, whether they're challenged by socioeconomic conditions, poor education, whatever the case may happen to be. We have them throughout our communities throughout this country. So that being the community, those are the communities oftentimes that require and call for the most police service. That is a data-driven fact. And in those communities where you have those challenges, where you may be challenged by violence, by gang activity, or wannabe gang activities, or murders or homicides, or whatever the case may happen to be, these are the calls for service most police departments are going to respond to first. This is where they're probably going to put the greatest amount of their resources. Now, the problem is here, if police pull out of those communities where they don't look as so much of a force, then no police is ever present. If police is present in those communities, then we're over-policing. And part of this stems from, in my opinion, and my experience tells me, is that there is not a collective working relationship that is systemically consistent throughout the community. You may have one group over here saying one thing, what they need from the police, and another group over here saying another thing, and the police never gets it right.
Brittany, when you hear Jill say that there's under-policing is a problem, do you agree?
You know, I really think the problem is that we're not talking about what safety looks like in our communities beyond policing. So, you know, when crime happens in Georgetown, they don't send a ton of police out there, right? When crime happens in the wealthy parts of New York City, they don't send a ton of police out there. They send them to Harlem. They don't send them over there. And so I want to make sure that we're being thoughtful about how often policing is racialized, because I went to a private, highly affluent high school, and there were never any police at my school. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, we can see a police officer drag a young woman from her desk at a public school, right? And there were certain kinds of kids at that school that the community deemed needed to be policed. But if we are truly thoughtful about, again, systemically how we create safe communities from the bottom up instead of over-policing them from the top down, then we won't be having this conversation. Because
So how do you do that?
So education will be such that people don't have to engage in crime in order to make money and feed their family, right? People won't have to engage in certain activities because they've got employment opportunities, healthcare, housing, all of the things that it takes to create a whole healthy community. And if we're thinking about public servants as we should be, folks who derive their power from the people and who should all be serving and protecting us, not just the police officer, but the teacher, the firefighter, the city councilor, the mayor, if all of those people are getting together with parents, children around the table and saying, how are we building that community from the bottom up, and making sure that when we do need officers, right, that the policies are such that we can see justice in our communities and not harm done, that's the conversation I want to see.
Dub, what would you do differently in training to avoid situations like that cost the life of your son?
I think it's attitudinal. I think the attitude of law enforcement has changed so much over the last 3 or 4 decades. We're very adversarial. We use a lot of labels. The labeling is a process that probably started in certainly in the late 70s, early 80s. We label things, from the standpoint of constitutionality. Almost every constitutional amendment there is being violated in one way or another today. We have district attorneys who have the power to determine justified or unjustified. That's not due process. It's not guilt or innocence. But officers are not taken into the courtroom where the evidence is presented against an officer who has wrongfully taken some life. It's stopped before it gets to the court, the judge, the jury, with immunity. We have immunity for law enforcement personnel. If they qualify for immunity, then there is no prosecution. The evidence can't be used. So there's so many problems, and it's complicated.
Jill, you, like all of us, have heard of the Ferguson effect, which is the hypothesis that law enforcement, in response to the criticism of the police in Ferguson and other incidents like it, has taken a more hands-off approach to their jobs and are, in effect, neglecting their duties. Do you think the Ferguson effect is real?
You know, I don't know. It's so hard to know anything in criminal justice. There's so little really good information. I would suspect not, because, again, when you say police department, you're talking about municipal bureaucracies, and they tend to have their own momentum. They tend to work in certain prescribed ways year after year. They're actually, every police chief I've ever known has talked about trying to turn the Titanic. It's very hard to change anything in these organizations. And so I would imagine they kind of go, the machinery kind of works the way it
Let me ask you
work.
the same question, Cedric. I mean,
Now, anecdotally speaking, I would say no, and certainly not in DeKalb County, Georgia, certainly not in Atlanta, certainly not in Rochester, New York. But for a brief moment, we saw that in Baltimore, and for a brief moment, you saw it here in New York City. So you can't you can't cover or paint all police departments with the same brush. But here's what's important I need to be able to convey, is that policing in this country needs major reform. And we got to reform our police departments.
And where would you start?
That begin with how we recruit, even how we advertise. We got to get away from advertising with SWAT gear and start advertising with this being a guardian profession and not an occupying force profession. So that in and of itself, how we start out, is how we're going to end up. And I think if we start recruiting better, if we start training better, if we take the lessons that we're learning every day and take these young men and women who are coming out of college, coming out of military, coming out of high school, coming out of wherever, they have a far greater advantage than I had 39 years ago when I started in this profession. They're much more culturally aware and sensitive. They're very much in tune with technology. Their minds are open to change and differences and to new ideas. And I think those are great opportunities that we all have to make sure in our own communities that type of recruiting is taking place. Now, once you have them in your police environment, you also have to make sure that they're managed appropriately. They got to have good bosses. They got to have good role models, because they truly are your next generation of police officers that are going to provide that guardian relationship. But here, and I'll close with this, there is no public safety without police, and there's no public safety without community. You have to be partnered. You have to be married to each other in order to reduce crime. People could give less than a damn about what percentage of crime has been reduced in their community. What people are more concerned with in most cities across this country is, what is my relationship with my local police department? Do I have to feel feared of them because I see blue lights? People are more concerned about their relationship as opposed to reducing crime. And you're not going to reduce crime in this country. I don't care what technology you have. I don't care what data-driven information you're operating from. If you don't have that relationship between that police and that community, you will not see that reduction in crime that you're looking for.
Brittany, let me ask you about the Ferguson effect in Ferguson, since you are right there at ground zero. I mean, Ferguson has symbolic taken on a symbolic resonance, but it's also a place.
Yeah.
And what changes have you seen after all the attention from the Justice Department, from journalists, from the state of Missouri? What are things like there now? Are they better?
You know, there's been a lot of effort put in. And we've seen some changes. The city council is slightly more diverse. There's a new police chief in Ferguson. And yet, as much as things change, many things still stay the same. But I want to push a little bit on the premise of the question, because if we're going to blame something on Ferguson, we have to talk about what the roots of Ferguson were, right? The uprising in Ferguson and in Baltimore and the movement that we've seen spread across this country exists because institutional racism and oppression exists. And so if you want to talk about what happens because what is or is not happening because of Ferguson, you have to talk about why Ferguson happened. I'm not concerned about talking about the branch of the tree. I'm concerned about talking about what's at the root, right? And how we uproot the whole thing. And so what has continued to happen across St. Louis is, yes, a conversation about relationships, but I think we were talking about this earlier, I think we have to be thoughtful about what relationships get us. Relationships are important, but they only get us so far, right? This idea that an officer like Darren Wilson is just a bad apple is problematic because we're really talking about entire systems that can be complicit in people's death. Now, when you talk about a system, that means that people actually have to face the fact that we're implicated too, right? That if you've been in this system for however many years, that you're implicated as well. But we have to talk beyond relationships, even though they're important, to systemic changes. And so some of the things we've been working on in Ferguson and quite broadly, quite frankly, nationally, are issues of citizen review and oversight of the police, are issues of demilitarization, use of force. We just put out a report, and you would be surprised how many major metropolitan police departments, not only is their use of force policy not available online, when they release it, it's heavily redacted, as the Houston Police Department did when we did a Freedom of Information request of them, and how many of those policies do not prioritize the preservation of life. I mean, that phrase is not even in there. So when you talk about using deadly force and assessing when it's necessary or not, the guidelines and the rules that you have going into that situation, some of them don't even talk about preserving life as the #1 priority.
Jill, I'm sorry, I didn't want to stop you, please.
But I was just going to say, so this idea that we get to relationship and also get to systemic change is critically important if we're going to see a change in the Fergusons all across America.
Jill, Cedric said people are concerned about their relationship with the police more than they're concerned about the amount of crime. Do you agree?
That is probably generally true. The truth about violent crime in this country is that it's very, very concentrated into pockets, and many people never experience violent crime, and some people experience it as a daily part of their lives. In South Central LA, in Watts, where I was working, in 8 square miles, they were having 80 murders a year during the first...
How many?
60 to 80 a year. So you can do the math. The people who were dying were primarily poor black men, not just, by the way, youth, not just 18 to 24, but all the way up into their 40s. And there were years where not a single one of those deaths made the paper or got any news coverage at all. To those people, to people who are losing sons, it's everything. But, you know, even in a high homicide context, that's a very small minority of people who are feeling it so directly. They're always going to be a minority. Most people are not going to feel that catastrophic loss from crime.
We are out of time. So I thank our panelists, and I thank you all for listening.